So obviously, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here today and actually taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn more about a phenomenon that's spread across the Middle East and the Gulf. The Arab Spring certainly made no exceptions, even to the economically prosperous part of the Arabian Gulf. So whilst the Arab Spring initiated successful revolutions, namely the December 17th Tunisian Revolution and the January 25th Egyptian Revolution, it also produced revolts that were not able to completely achieve their mission. And at the forefront of this is the February 14th revolution in Bahrain and the March uprisings in Saudi Arabia.
So whilst the Arab Spring did infiltrate the GCC countries, the repercussions and manifestations varied from one Gulf state to another. The hope for change entered some of these states swiftly and inconspicuously, while the hope for others was met by strength and violence. Gulf states were unnerved by the Arab Spring and therefore attempted to exit the turmoil across the region with the least damage and use it as an opportunity to cement their stature.
So today, this event will actually seek to discuss the forgotten revolutions of the Arab Spring. Forgotten because we regard these revolutions in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia as actually being overlooked by the international community due to the government's success in quashing the hopes of millions and ordering a crackdown on pro-democracy activists. It will enlighten us all on the struggle activists and everyday Bahraini and Saudi people are facing as they continue to fight for their basic freedoms and democratic rights. However, there is still hope for change as we commemorate the laudable efforts of those human rights defenders and democracy freedom fighters who seek reform, as well as highlight their ongoing political struggles. In this event today, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes before we have a Q&A session at the end. The chat will be open after all panelists have spoken, so we kindly ask you just to note any questions until then. And if you could please state who you are also addressing your question to, that would also be greatly appreciated.
So we'll begin with the host of our event, Bambos Charalambos, the Shadow Foreign Minister for the Middle East and North Africa. Since coming into his role, Bambos has supported the democratic struggle in Bahrain and has been a vital advocate for calling for the release of political prisoners. We're grateful for Bambos taking time out of his busy schedule to host this event for us.
Thank you, Razvan. It's a pleasure to be taking part in this panel. I'm sure we're going to have lots of interesting discussion and lots of questions at the end. So I'm the Shadow Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, and I've been in that role since December. And one of the things I would say is it was a pleasure to meet some of the people involved with the human rights and campaign for freedom of the political prisoners. It was the first debate I had I took part in my role as the Shadow Minister was about political prisoners in Bahrain. It was a debate held by, that was requested by Brendan O'Hara, which he successfully managed to get. And what was quite interesting was the UK government's view on this, because, and this is, the UK government don't want to focus too much on the Middle East because they're quite happy with the way things are at the moment. And I think you have to view the UK response from the prism of what suits the UK's interests. It's always been whatever foreign policy is about has been tended to be about what the UK's best interests are in this situation. So they're quite happy for things to remain as they are. And they don't particularly like the spotlight being highlighted on the Middle East or on any issues involving some of the not just the Gulf states, but other countries where the UK has an interest as well in the region. So that's the first thing I'll say. And if you want a very clear recent example as to how much importance the UK attaches to the significance of the Middle East, you'll have seen that following the move of James Cleverly to the Shadow to be the Minister for Europe, his brief as Shadow Middle East Minister has been given to Amanda Milling, who is also covering Southeast Asia in that brief. So instead of one whole minister for the Middle East, I've now got half a minister looking at the Middle East and also East Asia as well. And bear in mind, East Asia is a huge brief in itself. That means that they want to have very little attention in relation to this. So I think you can judge by that what the UK intention is. Now, with us in the Labour Party, one of the things that we're very keen on is the promotion of human rights in all countries. We think human rights are universal and they should pervade across all countries. Otherwise, you cease to have any credence if you don't apply that logic. So we believe in human rights everywhere, and that will underpin our policy, our foreign policy for the future. We also believe that, and I made this reference in my speech, Bahrain is a friendly country, but sometimes you have to tell your friends, you have to stand up to them and be critical to them when they're doing things wrong. So I will have a meeting at some stage with the Bahraini ambassador. At the moment, I've let's just say we've not had the best of relations so far in our communications with each other. But we do want to make sure that we have cordial relations, because the UK does have huge influence in the region. And one of the things I would say is that the UK could have done so much more when the Arab Spring was happening, trying to bring reform to those countries. That certainly hasn't happened in Bahrain, who seem intent on locking people up for a long period of time if they are protesting, and also the bloodshed that was spilled following the protests, not only just at the time of the Pearl roundabout protest, but subsequent to that, there have been protests on a regular basis since then, and they've all been suppressed. And you also saw the Saudi Arabia also getting involved in suppressing the protesters during the protests it's 11 years ago now, isn't it? So in 2011. You do see this happening. You've got the US Fifth Fleet there. The US were quite happy to stand back and not do anything about it. And the UK were also happy to be bystanders there as well, because they both have vested interests. And the reason for that is, even though Bahrain's population is tiny, it's about about a quarter of London's population, or a fifth of London's population in total. Strategically, it's of huge importance because it occupies that location in the Gulf, directly opposite Iran, and there is great concern about Iran being an actor in the region and the instability that this poses. And even though we are looking at Saudi Arabia and Bahrain in this discussion, I think we also need to look at what's happened in some of the other countries that had uprisings during the Arab Spring. I've seen some instability there in some places. Obviously, Tunisia was quite successful in having a revolution, although I think people might be quite critical at the moment as to what's happened there with the president taking some more controls. But in places like Libya, there was great optimism at first, but now the country is deeply divided. There'll be elections coming soon, and there is deep division. The country is almost like split in two, and you hear some people saying that we wish the Arab Spring hadn't happened here because there's instability in that country. That's a bad example. That shows that what can happen when there's a void. You also saw what happened in Egypt. So you had the Muslim Brotherhood, and again, that was that led to changes in that the Muslim Brotherhood were deemed to be unacceptable, and that led to a reversal as to what happened in Egypt. So again, these sometimes that a void is created, and unless you have something that can fill that void, there is potential to problems. I mean, a classic example is Syria. Syria at the moment is a classic example where that led to a very bloody civil war. And I won't get started on Yemen. That's a whole other sort of thing. So there are pitfalls and dangers. There's, sometimes people say, be careful what you wish for. But clearly one of the things that we are very clear about are the restoration of human rights, the release of political prisoners. And I think Bahrain hasn't shown much willingness to engage in those things. And they're being allowed to get away with it. And I think that's part of the problem, because I think there needs to be a greater pressure put on them by some of the Western countries they regard as allies. And I think it's our role to make sure that that message comes across loud and clear. And yeah, we raised the issues. I think everyone who spoke in the debates we had in January about political prisoners in Bahrain, I think everyone mentioned Dr. Abdullah al-Singais and Hassan Mushemi. So there's two of the political prisoners who are being held in Bahraini prisons and been held there for quite a long time. There are many others who don't have the problems that those two have, but it's certainly many of the opposition MPs raised these concerns, but they just fall on deaf ears. So we're keen to put pressure on them. We don't think that human rights should be traded for having a good trade deal with the Gulf countries. We think the two go hand in hand. We expect high standards from our partners, and this is something that we very much want to promote. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour as to where we're coming from. I'm keen to speak out about human rights when I can, when I'm speaking about foreign affairs. And as I've said, we have to make sure that human rights are universal, so we have to apply them equally. And even if a country is friendly, that makes it even more important for you to try and use your influence to make sure they're complying with human rights. I'll leave it there because I know we've got 5 excellent speakers after me, and I don't want to take up all the time just speaking on that. But I very look forward to questions at the end. So I hope that's been helpful, Asta and Razvan. So over to you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bambos, for those obviously encouraging words. I think given its closeness with the government of Bahrain, it's really necessary for the UK government to address these issues, not only to help achieve long-term stability in the region, but also in the name of upholding itself as a champion of human rights. So I think this has become more apparent following the backbench parliamentary debate, as you mentioned, that occurred last month. And so we thank you for your ongoing support and cooperation with the democracy struggle in both Bahrain and Saudi.
So our first speaker actually is Dr. Aiden Hever. And Dr. Aiden is a reader in international relations at the University of Westminster. His research interests include transitional justice, humanitarian intervention, and state building in Kosovo. He's the author and editor of 10 books, with his most recent book, Hollow Norms and the Responsibility to Protect, winning the 2019 British International Studies Association Book Prize. He has published over 50 academic book chapters and journal articles, is the co-editor of the Routledge Intervention and State Building book series, and is a regular contributor to national and international television and radio. So thank you, Dr. Hever, for joining us today and starting off the event.
Thank you, Razvan, and thank you to everybody involved in organizing this very important event. As Razvan said there, I'm not a specialist on the Middle East or Bahrain, but I wrote about Bahrain and the Arab Spring a lot when the situation erupted in late 2010 and then obviously accelerated in 2011. And I certainly looked at it from the point of view of the international community's response to what was happening in Bahrain. So that's what I'm going to focus on in my brief talk today. As was mentioned by Bambos there, the Arab Spring began with a huge amount of optimism. We're very excited. Initially, it seemed to be something that was inherently good. Progressive change was going to sweep across the region, but it has largely failed. Now, I think we can, we would have expected the regimes and the elite in these countries to resist change, to keep the situation as it was. But what has been surprising, I suppose not surprising, but certainly what is noteworthy, is the extent to which the democratic West and human rights organizations, certain human rights organizations, have also facilitated the continuing oppression and the maintenance of a number of these regimes. The Arab Spring obviously came as a massive shock. I don't think anybody really predicted it. The reason why it was such a shock was because the regimes in the Middle East and North Africa seemed so stable and so strong. It's worth noting, and I think this is very important, that one of the reasons why these regimes seemed so stable and strong was the extent to which they got external support from very powerful Western states as well. It wasn't just the non-West that supported these regimes, that the West was very much a sponsor of many of these regimes, and that enabled them to maintain their system of oppression and torture, and to dampen down on democracy. And in that sense, then, the West's initial response to the Arab Spring, and certainly its response more generally, has to be seen in that light. Certainly when the situation escalated in Tunisia, there was very mixed messages, to say the least, coming from France and other countries. There was often a kind of a cold response to the pro-democracy movements on the ground in the Middle East and North Africa. It then became a situation where, the West began to support a number of these movements when the momentum accelerated, and in certain cases was very supportive of the overthrow of certain regimes, obviously Libya being the prime example, but not supportive in all cases. And this is where Bahrain comes in. And I remember reading about what was happening in the Middle East at the time and wondering why there was so little coverage of what was happening in Bahrain. And I wrote an article about this where I described it as a blind spot. I often ask my students about the situation in Bahrain, and I begin by showing them an image of the Pearl Roundabout after it had been demolished, and ask them, does anybody recognize this image? And only once in 11 years has anybody ever said it's the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain. And I asked them then, why do you think it is that this situation, this particular case, where there was a pro-democracy, a peaceful pro-democracy movement emerged on the streets of Bahrain, why is it that you know nothing about it? Why do you think that this has been obscured? And what it ultimately evidences, I think, that the international response to Bahrain is that the US and the UK and France, as permanent members of the UN Security Council, have continued, despite their rhetoric, have continued to prioritize national interests over the protection of human rights. And also, and I think this is something that doesn't get talked about enough, there are a number of supposedly human rights organizations, particularly human rights organizations related to the responsibility to protect, that present themselves as neutral observers and defenders of human rights internationally, who have also completely ignored the situation in Bahrain, which again, I think evidences the link between power, money, and people's willingness to speak up about human rights violations. In terms of the actual uprising itself, the narrative that was presented and still is presented in many quarters today about what happened in Bahrain tends to be that it was a violent uprising. It was led by Shia extremists who targeted Sunni people, and it was backed by Iran. And that enables people to defend the Bahrain government's response to the situation. But of course, it's just simply not true. Now, I'm not going to go into massive detail about the nature of the situation of the attempted revolution, if you will, in Bahrain, but it's very clear that the movement itself had widespread support and wasn't just Shias. On the 16th of February, following the Facebook page called the February 14th Revolution of Bahrain, which called for protests, on the 16th of February, there was 12,000 people gathered at the Pearl Roundabout in very festive mood, as it was described at the time. And then on the next day, 1,000 police came and cleared the protesters from the roundabout. 3 people were killed, and this escalated the tension. The funerals of those that were killed became rallies for the opposition, and by the 19th of February, the protesters had regained control of the Pearl Roundabout. And again, in a celebratory mood, very peaceful. Even the Crown Prince at the time accepted that the protesters constituted what he described as a very significant proportion of our society. Then there was a strike on the 20th of February, where something about between 80 and 85% of employees in Bahrain took part in a nationwide strike. So again, very, very well supported nationwide strike. And by the 26th of February, people were demanding the removal of the monarchy. But it's worth noting again that even when the nature of what people were calling for changed and escalated to regime change, if you want to call it that, the reports suggest that the protesters remained peaceful. It was on the evening of the 14th of March then that the Gulf Cooperation Council sent its troops into Bahrain to, and I quote, according to the force commander, the aim was to help the government to bring goodness, peace and love to Bahrain, which somewhat ironic. But But again, this was justified as being we have to deal with external threats. All the protesters have been backed by Iran. They're violent. They're Shia extremists, etc., etc. Thereafter, then on the 15th, the king passed the royal decree declaring state of emergency. And what this did then was it opened the door for the perpetration of grave violations of human rights, including arbitrary deprivation of life, torture, and arbitrary detention. And then on the 16th of March, infamously, the police were sent in to clear the protesters from the Pearl roundabout itself. The International Crisis Group, and there's many reputable international organizations that said similar things, described the government's response as brutal repression and sectarian in nature. Some 28 mosques, Shia mosques, were demolished following March 2011. Now, what happened then was that the government sponsored a widespread torture of anybody involved in the demonstrations. And between February and April, at least 35 people were killed, 5 of them tortured to death. This was condemned by a number of organizations around the world, but notably, and I'll talk about this in a minute, not so much by the UN Security Council or reputable human rights organizations. What happened then was that the government, the Bahrain monarchy, released the what's called the Biki Report to look into what happened, and it made recommendations about what the monarchy should do going forward. And this was seized upon by many of Bahrain's external allies as, we can now say it's been dealt with. Okay, the government has agreed to implement these reforms, so that's fine, we can move on. Okay, maybe it wasn't great what they did, but at least now they've atoned for it. You can read various different reports about the extent to which the government in Bahrain actually implemented these reforms. The promises they made simply were largely ignored. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, I'm just looking down through a list here, they all reflected on the government's willingness to engage in the implementation of the various different reforms that were promised in 2011. And ultimately, all concluded that this was just lies, essentially, that it was a form of kind of PR exercise, that these changes hadn't actually been made. And right up to the present day, as was mentioned in the beginning, we still have systemic human rights violations taking place in Bahrain. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is the nature of the international community's response, both to the situation on the ground in 2011, to the lack of any meaningful implementation of the reforms promised thereafter, and at the moment in 2022. The Security Council's response to Bahrain was negligible. The Security Council didn't pass a single resolution or presidential statement mentioning Bahrain. Again, I don't think you need to be a genius or a conspiracy theorist to work out why that is. Both the US and the UK are allies of Bahrain. As was mentioned earlier, the US chose Bahrain as the base for its naval Fifth Fleet, declared Bahrain to be a major non-NATO ally in 2002, and has continued to sell arms to Bahrain even after the 2011 uprising. The UK similarly described the relationship with Bahrain as crucial to the UK's pursuit of its national strategic aims, and basically said, well, we need these guys, they're too important for us, and we know bad things are happening there, but ultimately, they're far too important. Now, for somebody like me, or for anybody who's, anyway clued up about international relations, it's maybe not a massive surprise that states think about themselves when they engage in international relations, but it's certainly dispiriting. And it must be remembered, I think, when we hear Western governments talk about the protection and promotion of human rights, that there are places like Bahrain in 2011, and certainly not the only example, that simply contradict those promises. It just isn't credible to present yourself as a defender of human rights around the world, whilst at the same time supporting a regime that is torturing people to death. What's more surprising, possibly, is the fact that a certain group of non-governmental organizations that present themselves as well as neutral observers of human rights, and particularly with respect to the responsibility to protect, that these groups themselves neglected to mention Bahrain, both in 2011, in 2012, and 2013. Now, as I said, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, International Crisis Group, they all spoke about Bahrain and didn't pull any punches. But organizations like the Global Center for R2P, the International Coalition for the Responsibly Protect, the Asia Pacific Center for Responsibly Protect, basically any international organization aligned to the Responsibly Protect can go through their publication record. There's no mention, essentially no mention of Bahrain. Now, again, most of these organizations are funded by Western governments. And in that sense, again, I don't think it's too much of a leap to say, well, somebody somewhere said, let's not criticize what's happening in Bahrain because that's going to impact on our relationship with the United States or the UK or France or one of these big Western states that provides us with funding. Similar thing happens, of course, invariably with respect to the situation in Gaza and Palestine more generally, where again, these organizations studiously avoid any mention of Palestine. They're very happy to talk about South Sudan or Central African Republic or something like that, but they avoid specific cases because the governments in those cases are friends with the West. What it ultimately means, I think, in practice, and I'll finish on this, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights claimed that the lack of any international condemnation of what happened on the 16th of March 2011 emboldened the monarchy. And they noted the authorities in Bahrain, due to the lack of international consequences, have no incentive to stop the human rights violations. So this lack of condemnation has had a definite impact on the.
Do you want to say something?
Yes.
Sorry, somebody's.
I want to.
This is India. 2010.
And follow my lead. Well, I found a girl, beautiful and sweet.
Your link is be spammed by India.
Yeah, baby.
Oh, Brain, you are enjoying. Brain probably is enjoying this.
As can you intervene and just block him?
Vera Calprese.
Ali, can you do something?
Yep, sorry about that. It seems like we're having some disruption from.
Asta Paul. My name is also Paul. What a call.
Asta, can you mute everybody and just
Yeah, we're on it.
allow the speaker to speak?
Yeah, we're on it.
Fuck me.
Don't do this, bro, please.
Lewis, are we all good with the moderating?
Yeah, I think we're good now. Sorry for that.
Sorry about that disruption. Dr. Aiden, if you'd like to continue, we really apologise about that. It seems that,
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I must have been saying something right, I guess, if somebody
yeah, clearly.
intervene. Can only be a good sign. Yeah, I was pretty much just going to wrap up there with just by saying that, human rights are meant to be universal in nature, but they're very much created to politics. Some people are left to endure.
One second, gentlemen. Hi, Asta Paul. Are you from?
Only in love, not knowing what this was.
A movie.
Land.
I think you should mute people and make sure that they can't unmute themselves.
Subscribe to Vision. Subscribe to Vision.
Okay, I'll try and go again. But just like I said,
Hey, what are you saying?
I think there's usually a button that allows you to mute all, and doesn't allow participants to unmute themselves.
Lewis, can you mute everyone so that and then only one person you can control?
You guys should be okay now. Let's give it a go now. Sorry for that.
Okay, yeah, as I said, just that it was the final sentence anyway. Just going to conclude by saying, evidently, human rights are meant to be universal in nature, but they're prey to geopolitics, not just by states, but also by human rights organizations. Some people are left to endure repression and torture and murder simply because their government is deemed to be an ally by a powerful state, and not just undemocratic states, but Western states as well. And the situation in Bahrain today is a function of the fact that many Western states have supported Bahrain, not just in the last 10 years, but certainly going back 40, 50 years. And one would hope that if the UK and the US want to be taken seriously, then they have to actually stand up for human rights and put into practice the rhetoric they invariably put forward. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aiden. I think it's really important to understand how the revolution in Bahrain actually did unfold and how the international community simply ignored the Bahraini desire for democratic change for their own strategic personal interests. Like Dr. Aiden said, it clearly seems to be that we are talking along the right track, and clearly people are here to disrupt, but we're ready to take on this event. So next we actually will have Professor Madawi Al-Rashid. We will hear her thoughts, and Professor Madawi is a British citizen of Saudi origin and is actually the granddaughter of Mohammed bin Talil al-Rashid, the last prince of the Emirate of Hell, who was conquered by the now ruling Al Saud family in the early 20th century. Madawi is a visiting professor at the LSE Middle East Center, where she has been conducting research on mutations amongst Saudi Islamists after the 2011 Arab uprisings. This research focuses on the new reinterpretations of the Islamic texts prevalent amongst a small minority of Saudi reformers and the activism in the pursuit of democratic governance and civil society. Thank you so much, Professor Madawi, for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And the disruption we experience is probably some kind of hacking or somebody trying to hijack the event. It's unfortunate, but it's happening in Britain. And this is a lesson that we have to learn. And I will talk about that in a minute. My talk is going to be very brief because we don't have a lot of time. So I will focus on Saudi Arabia 2011. Then I will talk about the lessons that we have learned from the Arab uprisings across the region. And finally, I would like to use the opportunity of having Mr. Shalambos join us, and hopefully the message will get across, and we're honored that he is listening to us. So what happened in Saudi Arabia is not on the scale of what happened in Egypt, Tunisia, and Bahrain and the rest of the Arab world. However, Saudi Arabia did experience a wave of a protest, especially in the eastern province, where the majority of the Shia population live, but also in the central province in Qasim and Riyadh. So the ripple effect of the Arab uprising resonated with many Saudis. And although the demonstrations were very, very small because of the repression and the mobilization of state security forces, it wasn't possible for many people to come to the streets. However, we have seen since 2011, first of all, there were some serious atrocities in the eastern province where many, many Shia died, were shot by the security forces. And also in the central province of Saudi Arabia. What had happened was that the Saudi regime mobilized its financial, economic resources in order to project that the demands for democracy, justice, and human rights was irrelevant. And the Saudi state media and even Western media tried to portray the limited demonstrations in Saudi Arabia as a call for improving the infrastructure of the country. For example, allowing more housing to be built, better health, and better infrastructure. Although the demands were very clear that Saudis actually wanted equality, wanted justice, and wanted also a transition towards democracy. So the Saudi regime used money in order to silence the voices, but in a sinister way. Since 2011, we have seen the worst wave of detentions in Saudi prisons. And this wave of detention encompassed a whole range of activists and critics of the regime, from the Islamists to the liberal, the feminist, and Shia and Sunni. So there was an indiscriminate campaign to arrest anybody who criticized the government. And this started in 2011. It doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia did not have this detention syndrome, that any critic of the regime would end up in prison forever and maybe come out after several years without trial. But the scale of the detention became extremely troubling for many people. So in Saudi Arabia, we see this situation evolving, and it got worse since 2015 with the arrival of Prince Salman, who became king in January 2015, and then even worse when his son became crown prince, his son Mohammed bin Salman. And until the present day, there are hundreds and perhaps thousands of detained Saudis who are dissidents. And the same story unfolds again, in the sense that the detainees are representative of Saudi society with its diversity and complexity of the political thinking that exists in the country, from the Islamists to the feminists. I'm sure everybody heard about Lujain al-Hudhul, a young activist who called for the right to drive and the right to remove the guardianship system that is imposed on women. She was detained and she was only released last year, but she is not allowed freedom of speech, and she is still banned from travel. And hundreds others stay in prison at the moment. So that is the situation in Saudi Arabia at this particular time. I can speak as the spokesperson of the National Assembly Party, which was a political party established here in London, together with many Saudi exiles and asylum seekers, whose number had increased incredibly since 2011, as they faced the repression, and as they refused to silence themselves, they opted out for leaving the country, which is ironic given that Saudi Arabia has millions of immigrants who go there to work and see their migration to Saudi Arabia as an opportunity. And we see that many Saudi youth are actually leaving the country and going nowhere but to the countries that support the regime that has played an important role in pushing them out of the country. Mainly they are in Canada, the USA, Britain, Europe, Australia, and basically most of the Western countries that are allies to the Saudis. So I want to move very quickly to the lessons that we have learned from what happened in Bahrain, what happened in North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and also in Yemen. Syria is an extremely important case. So the lessons that we have learned almost 11 years after this uprising, that the Arab world is actually a single area in terms of its aspiration. once the demonstrations started in Tunisia, they moved to Egypt, then Libya, then Syria, Bahrain, etc. Within almost 2 months, we have the whole of the Arab world. So the interconnectedness of this region is extremely important. It is common to say, well, there's the wealthy Gulf countries and there's the other poor Arab republics. But in terms of the desire and the aspiration of the people, they have the same aspirations in terms of democracy, justice, human rights, and also accountable government. So the Arab world is a pool whereby people are actually under the same pressure in terms of their economic livelihood and their political rights. The second lesson that we have learned, that it is impossible for a single revolution to succeed in the Arab world when we have a sea of authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. So the Bahraini uprising was the closest to Saudi Arabia, and it did inspire Saudis who had similar grievances. But it was perhaps our wishful thinking to begin to contemplate the idea that Bahrain can succeed when it is surrounded by dictatorship, and also a bridge that connects Saudi Arabia to Bahrain is so small. So it is impossible for a single revolution to succeed if it is surrounded by a sea of authoritarian and regimes and dictatorships. And therefore, the complementarity of the Arab world is so clear to us now. And then when revolutions, that's another lesson we learned, when revolutions almost succeeded, such as in Tunisia and in Egypt, we find that, first of all, they did not really succeed in institutionalizing their gains. But this is not to blame them for the failure of the revolution, simply because there are serious counter-revolutionary forces that were determined to abort that experience, to undermine the limited success they had. And therefore, we have a situation now in Egypt and in Tunisia that has basically returned to the status quo ante, and even worse than that. Another lesson that we have learned is that Gulf money is extremely important in a counter-revolutionary force. The Gulf monarchies, whether they are called kingdoms, emirates, sultanates, etc., they are still endowed with incredible resources. Quite a substantial part of these resources, mainly oil, rent, is invested in creating cordons sanitaires. That is creating like a lockdown, if you like, whereby no other country can actually succeed in establishing itself or moving towards a democratic transition, simply because they don't want that ripple effect to take place in their backyard and inside their own countries. And it is in their interest, these rich Gulf countries, to maintain the undemocratic regimes in the Arab world, simply because they are allies. And they do not want any democratic experiment that would lead to the election of parliaments, real elections, elected governments that may or may not agree with the policies of the Gulf monarchies. And then finally, what we have learned is that this Gulf money, wherever it's coming from, obviously not from Bahrain, because Bahrain is not as wealthy as the others, mainly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, they are willing to go as far as turning this peaceful protest that erupted in the Arab world into violent struggle, whereby they continue to support some radical groups in order to weaponize the peaceful struggle and therefore turn the moral high ground and deprive people from the benefit and the moral high ground of peaceful resistance and peaceful struggle. So as we have seen in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, the interest was into weaponize these peaceful revolutions. And in a sinister way also, the Gulf money succeeded in turning these peaceful protests into sectarian civil wars, such as what happened in Syria. And when it wasn't a sectarian civil war, such as in Bahrain, they managed to turn it into that using propaganda and their media empires. In a way, these lessons are extremely important in order to understand what happens when we go to the next chapter of Arab protest, which is inevitably going to happen simply because those who went to the streets in 2011 have yet to succeed in turning the tide and changing the conditions of authoritarian rule across the region. So, for the youth of the region, for the mobilization of those people, it's important to learn these lessons. And finally, in the remaining time, I don't think I have a lot of time, but I would like to address the West and mainly Britain. I won't be able to talk about the US and the others, but a strong message to Britain, and we are honored to have Mr. Bambus with us in order to get the message across. I do not want to talk about Britain worrying about abstract human rights in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. I do not want to talk about Britain's pledge to have a moral foreign policy. What I want to talk about is the following, that it is in British national interest to not to assist and not to empower these regimes against their own people or launching wars against their neighbors, such as what happened in 2015 when Saudi Arabia launched the war on Yemen, which we're not going to talk about now, but perhaps it's something important to remember. And therefore, it is the national interest of Britain to make its support for Saudi Arabia. After all, Britain is the second country that arms Saudi Arabia after the United States. So how is it? It is in the national interest of Britain. First of all, Britain needs to make its arms sales to Saudi Arabia conditional on Saudi Arabia abiding by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, respect for human rights, and not to empower it to block any impulse towards democracy. So Britain has, the last time I counted, almost 30,000 expat British citizens live in Saudi Arabia, and that was before COVID. But I'm not sure about the figures now, but Saudi Arabia hosts thousands of British expats who work in all sectors of the economy, from the military, from the educational, finance, consultancy, you name it. There are Brits in Saudi Arabia. And when those Brits and their human rights are violated in Saudi Arabia, the British government will find itself helpless in trying to get them out of Saudi Arabia. And we've had cases, I don't want to remind you of the several cases when British citizens in Saudi Arabia were tortured in Saudi prison, held without trial, were detained for extended period of time, and the Foreign Office could not do enough to secure their fair trial or release. So it is in the interest of Britain to, knowing that quite a lot of its nationals are in Saudi Arabia, to care about human rights in Saudi Arabia. The second issue is, I'm sure you all heard about the Israeli NSO company that had sold spying programs such as Pegasus to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, and the other. And now we, as activists, as academics, are subjected to this spying and surveillance technology that violates our privacy and our human rights on British soil. I'm not talking about people in Saudi Arabia or in Bahrain. We here in Britain are violated by the technology that Israel has sent to has sold to Saudi Arabia. And as such, the Saudis use it to hack us here in Britain, and we are British citizens. So that's important to understand. And I think we are not idealists for example, calling on the British government to cut its relationship with the dictatorships that exist in the Gulf. As one British diplomat said to me, if you ask us to cut our diplomatic relations with dictatorships, then there won't be anybody in the world to talk to. He also told me that don't ask us to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, because if we don't, the French would. So let's get beyond this kind of competition, the uncontrolled race to sell arms. And after all, there aren't more than 9,000 British jobs affected if Britain moderates its enthusiasm for empowering and weaponizing the Saudi regime, selling it more arms. And it's not only about selling, it's about the training contracts that the British government has, especially the Ministry of Defense with Saudi Arabia. There are British Ministry of Defense personnel, subcontractors who are on the ground in Saudi Arabia, directing its planes to bomb the children of Yemen. And therefore, and finally, I want to remind the British government, and hopefully this message will get across, that all of those academics who had been working on terrorism, who had working on radicalization, had made interesting conclusions that radicalization or the terrorism that the whole world had witnessed, and including us here on the streets of London, is actually grown, nourished under dictatorship. When governments shot everybody, abolishes civil society, does not allow freedom of speech, there is a good argument to say that these kind of political conditions are fertile ground to breed terrorism. Now, somebody would say to me, oh, but we had terrorists in Britain and Britain is a democracy. How come? Well, there are reasons for that. And therefore, if these regimes are empowered, they continue to terrorize their own people and also their own people abroad, such as what happened in 2018 when the Saudi regime sent a death squad to its own consulate in Istanbul and chopped up a journalist by the name of Jamal Khashoggi. So do we want our streets in London to become the battleground between the Saudi regime and the critics and the dissident who had taken refuge in Britain? Obviously not. And therefore, to conclude, I would say that the only way out for Britain in its relationship with these Gulf monarchies is to make its military support conditional on these countries respecting human rights and allowing a space for civil society to exist, a breathing space for them to be able to express themselves without fear of detention or even worse than that, torture in prison. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Rashid, for joining us today and actually speaking on Saudi and the Gulf. The analogy of an uprising not being able to succeed if located within a sea of dictatorships was a really interesting perspective to the debate and the conversation. So up next, we have Brian Dooley. Brian is a senior advisor at Washington, D.C. based NGO Human Rights First. He previously led Amnesty International's work on partnering with national NGOs in the Global South and was the head of media for Amnesty International in London and Dublin. And Brian has actually also addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva on Bahrain's violations of the rights to free expression and peaceful assembly. So it's a great pleasure to have you speak at today's event, Brian, and thank you for being with us.
All right, can you hear me? Lovely, thank you very much. Thanks very much for organising this and asking me to speak. I haven't been to Bahrain for almost exactly 10 years now. I made one attempt a few years ago to get in and was turned around at the airport, but I haven't been allowed in for 10 years, but I was there several times during 2011 and 2012 when I was documenting human rights abuses which were happening in the context of and the wake of the revolution there. I know time is becoming tight now for this session, so I'm going to keep it brief. I just really want to reflect on, I guess, things which I have changed my mind about in the last 10 or 11 years. That's not necessarily to say that I was wrong then and I'm right now, but certainly I see things, and certainly I see things in my approach to advocacy now with governments very differently than I did 10 or 11 years ago. I don't know, most of my advocacy has been in Washington with a series of US administrations now, but I've also spoke at parliaments and engaged with other government officials, probably in a dozen or more countries and at the UN. One thing I think actually is a little unfair is to describe the Bahraini revolution as forgotten. I think a previous speaker described it as being a blind spot. I just don't think that's true. And I think it's a little unfair to organizations like ECDHR, ADHRB, BIRD, Gulf Center for Human Rights. When I go to capitals to talk about Bahrain, the officials there generally know quite a lot about it because they've been pretty well briefed by these NGOs and others. I don't think that there's been a blackout on international media coverage. Of course, everybody always wants, and deservedly, more attention for the human rights situation in their country. But actually, I think those organizations and some other people in the Bahraini diaspora, Musa Ali Mushaima, Zainab Mariam Al-Khawaja, have done a tremendously successful job of keeping Bahrain on the international media agenda and on the international political agenda. And I don't think it's a good idea for us to talk ourselves into a place of despair that like no one is listening or everyone's forgotten, because I just don't think that's true and I don't think it's helpful. Now, what I think matters in terms of what we do with the amount of attention that there is how you convert that then into meaningful conversations with government officials. And I would say where I've changed my mind or what I've learned over the last decade, particularly in Washington, is that the US government, successive administrations, actually surprisingly non-ideological, apolitical to me. They really don't care, honestly, who's in charge in Bahrain. In terms of system of government, they don't care if it's a dictatorship, they don't care if it's a theocracy, they don't care if it's a secular democracy. As one or two of the previous speakers have said, they're interested in their, what's the latest jargon for it? Equities to balance, their own national interests, right? And they really don't care who's in charge as long as those are protected, and they're fairly obvious, the Fifth Fleet, the access in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, but increasingly also Bahrain as a customer for very, very large arms deals now. And so, while of course we should and do talk about human rights violations when I'm talking to, somebody in the National Security Council in the White House or the State Department or members of Congress, I just don't think that changes many minds. I mean, I think what they're most interested in hearing is if this government were to fall, the Bahraini government, who is there to take over? And I don't think they particularly care what flavor of politics those people are, as long as the US interests are protected. I mean, I started doing this sort of work and making actually very similar sorts of arguments to the US State Department in the 1980s over apartheid South Africa. And once the turning point for the US government, I believe, was when they realized that despite the communists in the government in waiting in the ANC, American interests would more or less be protected under a new majority-led South Africa. And I think, as far as is possible, and it's not that easy, to convince the US, if indeed you think that the point of the game is to try and get Western governments to change their mind, is to convince them that in a new Bahrain, their core interests are more or less going to be protected. I think, and I don't want to be too cynical here, but I think actually that there's much more of an audience for that in Washington than there is about, look how many people your ally is torturing or murdering, because, as we've seen, the US and the UK have pretty high threshold for embarrassment when it comes to being friends with murderous dictators. They, on balance, probably prefer that their allies weren't like that, but they're quite happy to tolerate that sort of extreme and large-scale human rights violations. The second thing I'd say, apart from the non-ideological stuff, is the short-sightedness of many of the government officials I speak to, again, particularly because I know that context best in Washington. Many of these people are very smart, and they absolutely see that it is not in the US, and I suspect it's the same logic in the UK. It's not in the national interest of those countries to be allied with ultimately unstable, repressive, authoritarian regimes, because you could see what could quickly happen, as happened in those late months of 2010 and early 2011, or in fact, for those of us old enough to remember how quickly the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, it really was a matter of weeks. And so things can change very quickly, but while they may accept that 10 or 20 years from now, they will regret being on the side of the authoritarian regime, being, as they were up until 1979, on the side of the Shah of Iran. Unless they think that that house of cards is going to collapse in the next year or 2 or 4, they're sort of not that interested, because that's going to be somebody else's problem. There is a massively high turnover in Washington in terms of members of Congress, in terms of the White House, in terms even of the State Department. So when I talk to State Department officials, for instance, who have a remit around Bahrain, their questions are, what's going to happen in the next year or 2? And they're quite happy to accept that the US policy is a disaster long term, but they're really not that interested in long term, because they'll be in a different job then. That will be somebody else's problem. I mean, I say this not to suggest there aren't things to do. I say it really to suggest that we might be thinking about different sort of ways to argue than we have been. When I talk to, and I have been for 10 or 11 years now, talk to American officials about political prisoners, for instance, a common question they have is around who might be a viable future opposition leader, indeed government leader. Because again, their interests really are in having people who are technically capable of running a new government. Not that bothered, in my experience, about how religious those people are, how dictatorial their inclinations might be, but just who might be some embryonic collection of people who are a government in waiting. So, in terms of what can be done, I would tell myself 10 years ago, if I could have, is to try to argue some of these lines, that the myopia, the short-sightedness, you might be able to afford if you're a government official, but you're gambling that you can. In fact, I would say some of the most sensible conversations I've had in terms of US government officials who take a longer view are with those from the intelligence agencies. The CIA seems to care much more about what American interests are going to be in 10 or 20 years' time than anyone in the White House or even anyone in the State Department does. I think the point the previous speaker made about radicalization is a very good one, because that really does worry the Americans. I have also been writing reports, making visits, doing the usual cataloging of terrible human rights violations in Egypt for the last 10 or 11 years. But the last couple of reports I've done, which is about how torture in Egyptian prisons translates into huge numbers of recruits for ISIS within the prison system, is getting attention and an audience in Washington that none of the previous reports, which were about torture of human rights activists, the repression of civil society, the harassment, the hacking of phones, All of those things, everyone would agree is terrible, but didn't really seem to threaten US interests in the way that bolstering ISIS recruitment because of people being tortured and turning to ISIS for revenge has. I think I will leave it there. I don't know what my myself 10 years ago would have made of this sort of advice, but I think that's what I've learned. And of course, in 10 years from now, I may have a very different approach. But I think to just keep doing the same things over and over again each year without reflecting on, what you might have done better, certainly when you look at some of these struggles, as I do now, because I'm so old, over a period of decades, then I think part of our responsibility is also to learn and adjust. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian, for joining us today and for speaking about how the US and the UK approach the situation in Bahrain. I think your years of experience are really invaluable for all of us. Our next speaker experienced firsthand the actions of the Bahraini government, and his name is Ali Abdullah. Ali is a blogger from Bahrain who founded Bahrain Online, the country's first pro-democracy site. He also works with Global Voices and Bahrain Watch. Whilst peacefully protesting for democracy and human rights, Ali was arrested in 2010 after the government's crackdown on journalists in the region. He left his home country in 2011 and has been in exile in the UK ever since. In 2013, Ali received the Freedom Prize from Danish think tank CPOS. Since seeking exile in the UK, Ali has continued his fight for human rights in Bahrain. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Razvan, and thanks everybody. I'll just pick it from what Brian was just saying and Madawi before, that for the rule of the Western world, if I may rephrase it like this, is to invest in the people rather than investing in the regimes. Because regimes, with their act, they might get into violating the human rights for basics, and this could lead to many problems. For their own interest, I mean, the United States or Europe, the stability in the region is a very important point, and the stability will not come if you are supporting oppressive regimes. As for my role, I would like just to talk about, I'll take you back to the history. When I created Bahrain Online, it was during the state emergency law, which was applied in mid-70s, when the government or the rulers canceled the parliament and freeze some of the constitution's articles that forced them to redo the election. And during that time, we entered what we call it the dark period, that there is no democracy, no freedom of expression, nobody can express himself in the country, and people may be going to prison for 3 years without any charge or interrogation, and this 3 years can be renewed for another 3 years. With that situation led to the 90s uprising. And during 90s uprising, I created Bahrain Online. It was a very dangerous period that nobody can talk about. I mean, the talking about politics or reform could cause you a very hard situation with the government and even with the society. So it was a very hard time. Then the National Charter came, and Bahrain Online played a very good role in educating the people about their constitutional right and human rights, what should be in the future of the Bahrain, how the reform should be, how the changing of the constitution to be. Bahrain Online played the main role on that. And when the king issued his own constitutions in 2002, Bahrain Online played the role that to boycott this constitution and boycott the election which happened in 2002. During the period from end of 90s until 2010, Bahrain Online played the main role in educating the youth and educating the people of Bahrain about their rights, about their how to organize themselves, how to go to cover the protest, because the traditional media wasn't covering what's going on the street. So the role that Bahrain Online was playing was annoying the regime and the government. So that's why when they tried to censor the website and arrest me in 2005 and in 2010 because they want to control the space. They don't want any other ideas or thoughts to be out of control. We didn't stick with the local laws. We have a wide area to allow people to express themselves and or to express their view of the reform. And that's when I've been arrested in 2010, I was severely tortured because of my role in Bahrain Online. And they say, how you dare to do that, such a thing to opposite the king or opposite the prime minister, how you write this article against the previous, our former prime minister. Then the Arab Spring started. It's all because I can think of the Bahrain Online when the 10 years of implementing Bahrain Online and educating the people and educating the youth. The result of that period is getting a well-educated generation that know their right, know that there is something wrong in this country and need to be corrected. And that's why they started their own revolution and they organized themselves through the website. They decided the place they want to sit in, the Lulu roundabout, which is just behind me. The press release, the photos, the videos, the international media was taking all their materials from Bahrain Online at that time. And because of the information are very important for the government, they want to control the flow of the information. They use the hacking tools for espionage and spyware, which Dr. Madawi was just talking about. We managed to discover many softwares being sold to the government of Bahrain that they have the ability to hack into devices without the user doing anything. It's a zero click. You don't know that there is a vulnerability in your system or in your device and they can hack it. We documented many cases of hacking that happened for human rights activists, for journalists, for human rights lawyers, for public figures, and even politicians. And they use this data or this information they extracted from the devices to blackmail some of the activists. Either you keep it quiet or you will be you'll be exposed online. And we have some cases that happen like that. So I don't want to run out of time, but I just want to mention that the new generation who made the 14th February Revolution didn't end yet. They are still alive. They are still rethinking of how to continue their revolution because they believe they are well educated. They will not accept to live the way me and my father or my grandfather used to live. They want dignity, they want freedom, and they see on the internet and in the media that the life is totally different than the way they live in it. So we are hoping that the world will listen to the people of Bahrain instead of just making communication with the government and the officials, because people of Bahrain are staying in Bahrain and the governments might change tomorrow or after a few days. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali, for enlightening us with your role in the democracy protests and for how important you and your organization really was to educating the youth and people in Bahrain, as well as the rest of the global world. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Julia Legner. Julia is an independent human rights consultant and the head of advocacy at London-based Saudi-focused NGO ALXT for human rights. She has over 7 years of work experience providing legal assistance and advocating on behalf of victims of human and labor rights violations in the MENA region. As a co-founder of MENA Rights Group, Julia worked on advancing the organization's lobbying and public advocacy efforts at the UN level. She holds a BA in Arabic and International Relations from the University of Westminster and an MA in Middle Eastern Politics from the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London. It's a great pleasure to have Julia be our last speaker and wrap up our event.
Thank you, Razvan. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I'll try to keep it really brief. Maybe we'll get in a few questions from the audience. So just want to share a few reflections of my work as a human rights practitioner. I mean, the Arab Spring really has taken a different shape and form in the different MENA countries and throughout the GCC. Well, we've seen in Bahrain more large-scale protests, to some extent protests in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, or protests by stateless population in Kuwait. Other countries like the UAE were largely spared of visible rebellion or protest. However, that doesn't mean that the Arab Spring didn't reach them. The revolutions that swept through the region really accelerated people's demands for civil liberties. And what followed was sort of like a similar approach by the governments in the region of containment and deterrence. So a little bit of that carrot and stick policy. On the one hand, in order to contain the uprisings, they granted some monetary and political concessions, while at the same time applying a harsh crackdown and repression of all dissenting voices and anyone questioning the legitimacy of the authorities. And I think what we've seen throughout the GCC countries is really like a set of shared malpractices and similar modus operandi, like the arrest of human rights defenders, then the adoption or amendment of cybercrime and anti-terrorism legislation to legally prosecute peaceful dissidents, the acquisition of surveillance technology, the development of cyber armies to infiltrate and monitor and control the very spaces that were used amongst people throughout the region to communicate during the uprisings. And what is also common among all the governments in the Gulf states is that they use the narrative of reform, while in fact implementing rather superficial or insufficient reform to, on the one hand, weaken social movements, and on the other hand, also appease their foreign allies. So I think, I mean, looking at the Gulf states today, we can't call what started happening in 2011 successful revolutions. I would just say it's like an ongoing process. I think the reasons that have led to the revolutions in the first place, such as high youth unemployment, economic hardship, social inequality, corruption, they're as present today as ever. So there's definitely the potential of, or a dormant potential of revolution and resistance. It's just that the civic space is probably, yeah, I mean, in many of the Gulf countries, non-existent and probably smaller than it was in 2011. So I think it's also really the civil society in that region, and now also in the diaspora, that comes up with ever more creative ways of trying to challenge the authorities, and that is also what gives me really hope in my work. To see the mobilization of activists in the diaspora, where they're not directly exposed to risks of reprisals, or not to the same extent as they are in their countries. And we see democracy movements such as the National Assembly Party in the Saudi context that Dr. Madawi Rashid mentioned, where really you see like hundreds of Saudi activists coming together from different segments of society, different ideologies, different regions, to form this democracy movement that basically just asks for like fundamental human rights, freedom of expression. And I think we also see that, and maybe in a way as a counter movement to this coordinated approach by the governments in the Gulf countries, we also now, I think, see more and more really the coming together of the different activists from the Gulf countries in the diaspora, and working jointly in initiatives like Diwan London, for example, which is a forum of Gulf Arabs to like discuss their concerns, speak about the issues in their countries, to deliberate about shared solutions and kind of share best practices. So I think, maybe I'll just leave it on that optimistic note, and we can get in some questions.
Thank you, Julia, for your very interesting perspective and for sharing your extensive knowledge with us on the situation on the ground in the Gulf state countries. We appreciate it.
So now that we've actually heard from our last speaker, we'd like to open up the chat for any questions that anyone may have. So please write down who your question is directed to, or if it is more general. And also please note that Professor Madawi has had to leave for a prior engagement. We've actually had some questions come in over social media over the past couple of days from people who've been unable to attend. And so our first one is actually directed towards Bambos. And the question is actually, what kind of policy shift would we see from a Labour government towards Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, or the Gulf in general, especially when it kind of comes to the democracy struggle and also the human rights violations that we've witnessed?
Obviously, the UK has a big influence to play in the region, so we want to carry on that positive relationship we have with those countries. But clearly, we want to have a focus that is human rights based, and we would try and encourage those countries to. We will, I've agreed to raise certain issues relating to political prisoners with the ambassadors that I've met already, and I'll continue to do that. Also to try and, some of the Gulf states are looking to greater reforms. Some are going faster than others. So obviously looking to encourage that. Whether you get to full democracy or not is another matter. But certainly we can be a positive influence. So I think it's laying down a marker as to what we'd be looking for as in the UK, as to what we'd expect them to be doing, and encouraging them to follow that path, and being critical of them when they don't do that. So as you'll have seen, I've spoken out in a debate about Bahrain and political prisoners. I think I used the phrase of being a critical friend or something along those lines, and that's what we'd want to do. The UK interests will not just be around sort of human rights. There'll be other factors that are tied into that, but certainly we want to have more of human rights emphasis to our foreign policy.
No, I think that sounds great. I think we have an open question, maybe for all the speakers, or maybe to anyone in particular. But the question is, how can the US and the UK prioritize human rights in the Gulf without actually undermining its relationships and strategic interests with these states? I'm not sure if anyone would take that. Maybe Brian or Bambos could take that one.
Yes, I'm happy to. The question is, how do they prioritize human rights without burning their bridges, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't think that's rocket science for them. I just don't think I think they don't want to do it. I mean, I don't think it's because they don't know how to. The equation for the US is how far should it piss off the Bahraini government in being particularly openly critical of it before it starts to risk, some negatives about, well, we're not going to buy your arms anymore, or, perhaps you might want to look for somewhere else to anchor your Fifth Fleet. And I think that the US, certainly over the last 10 years, has been pretty feeble about that. I think it's been far too easily bullied by Bahrain and hasn't pushed back and says, you need the fleet there as much, if not more than we do. And, if you stop buying our arms, then okay, you can go and buy them elsewhere. But, really, you don't want that Russian stuff. What you want is our stuff, and you want the prestige of of sending your military office to our war colleges. So I think that the US could absolutely push further than it does, but there isn't that much incentive for it to do. I mean, what it sees, are pretty aggressive overreactions by the Bahraini government anytime, or some of the time, that there is criticism by the US of the human rights record in Bahrain. I can't remember what year it was now, but during the Obama administration, and the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Democracy, Labour and Human Rights, Malinowski went to Bahrain, I mean, a senior US government official, and they chucked him out. Bahrain chucked him out, and it was like super embarrassing, and the US like didn't really do anything about it. They were just like, well, sorry about that. And so a short answer to the question is it's not so much a question of how they can do it, because absolutely it's not an all or nothing. It's like, you know, Bahrain also needs that relationship with the US, but the US really isn't prepared, or hasn't been over the last 10 years, to try and push that and test that to see how much reform it could achieve, because I just don't think there's that much energy around the motivation for the US to do that. It sees that that conversation, that dialogue, that pressure with Bahrain as ultimately being painful for itself, and so it tries to avoid that.
Asla, do you want me to touch on it as well?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah, so this is where diplomacy comes in. So, it's not a surprise to some of the Gulf states that when I meet with them that I raise human rights issues. So they do know it's coming. They do know it's a problem for them. So I think that's where diplomacy comes in, because they might have certain other asks of us. So it's kind of in a way, it's about sort of trying to do that sort of diplomacy that people won't necessarily sort of see out loud. The last thing you want to do is embarrass a country that you're friendly with. So it's about having those discussions and building up those relationships, and actually putting that pressure, using the soft diplomacy to try and make things happen.
So thank you, Bambos, for that answer, and Brian as well. So unfortunately, due to time and some of the earlier disruptions, we do have to end our Q&A short. Apologize for that. But I'd just like to thank everyone for all of the insightful and really interesting speakers that we had, and for sharing their insights on the Arab Spring, in particular Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, on this really important anniversary. So thank you again to all of our speakers. It's certainly a pleasure and an honor to hear from all of you. While most of us are familiar with the major events of the Arab Spring, it was quite fascinating to learn more about the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Both of those countries, however, are still currently experiencing a number of human rights issues, and it is important that Western countries like the UK and the US do take some action to address these violations. The fight for democracy is not an easy one, but it is an important fight. And with that being said, what are some steps that you all can take to support human rights in the Gulf?
So if you would like to help support or take some action, something you can do right now is email your local MP to sign Early Day Motion number 835. This motion was tabled by Margaret Ferrier, and it concerns human rights and in particular the ongoing detention of political prisoners. It calls for the unconditional release of political prisoners, including Dr. Al-Sin Gas and Hassan Mashema, and urges the Bahraini government to initiate a substantive and inclusive in-country dialogue on political and constitutional reform. The EDM also calls on the UK government to review its funding to Bahrain and to actually take action to hold Bahraini officials accountable for serious human rights violations. By clicking the link in the chat box and filling out your postcode, an automatic generated email will be sent to your local MP requesting them to sign EDM 835, which is actually already on 70 signatures. If your MP has signed the EDM already, then an email will also be sent out asking them to sign other EDMs related to human rights abuses in the Gulf. Furthermore, you can also show your support by keeping up to date with the activities of the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights by following us on Twitter at ECDHRBXL. Once again, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to all the speakers who have taken the time to be with us today. Shadow Foreign Minister Bambos Charalambos for his credible input, and to all of you who have attended and participated in today's proceedings. We're really trying to support the fight for human rights and democracy in both Bahrain and Saudi Arabia by giving exposure to the realities often overlooked and maybe neglected by the international community. However, the support you give by taking these small steps really play into the greater effort towards lasting change, and it is in fact possible and it's on its way. So thank you all for attending, and we really look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.